Outstanding job coming in, sitting so quickly, being so quiet. We are very appreciative of that. We are very fortunate today to have Mr. Steve Elster. Mr. Elster's father, Aaron Elster, was a Liberty presenter for many years. He passed away in April of 2018. In 2019, Mr. Steve Elster came to Liberty and presented. He was supposed to come in March of 2020, but you probably remember that COVID shut that down. He came back last year in 22, and now we're fortunate to have him here today to tell his father's story. At the end, some of the ELA classes created some questions. We'll have an opportunity to ask him questions at the end. We appreciate that you are a very respectful audience, being excellent listeners, and we appreciate Mr. Elster coming a long way today in the crazy rain to be with us. So without further ado, let's give a round of applause to Mr. Elster.
First, I want to get some logistics out of the way. Could everybody hear me, especially in the back? Excellent. Second, I'm 65 years old, and I still get emotional when I present. You will hear my voice crack. I will pause. I'll do what I can to get through this. It's always been difficult, but we'll make this happen. A question that I always ask to everybody here is, have you ever wondered what your purpose is in life? Maybe you've sat and wondered, what can I do to be a productive citizen to this country, to your family, to the school, whatever the case may be. Now I want you to hold on to that thought, so I'm going to come back to that as I've talked to you about a man that had no path in his journey, and at a very young age of 8 years old, he was thrown into such atrocities that occurred. He actually turned things around and became one of the most passionate speakers about being an upstander, and to never underestimate the power and the strength that you all possess.
It's important to have our history, our past documented.
How did you survive hiding in an attic from the Nazis?
Life in hiding was full of fear, hunger, cold, but through it all, I hoped and believed that I would live. My message is simple: be an upstander, be involved, make a difference.
Some of you may not know this, but that was actually a hologram of Dad at the Take a Stand Theater in the museum in Skokie. And of course, as I was introduced, I am Steve Elster. My father, Aaron Elster, again, who passed away about 5 years ago, actually, April 11th last week. It's the 5-year anniversary of his passing. He was a Holocaust survivor and the vice president of the museum in Skokie. He was born in 1931 in a very small town, in a town called Sokolov Podlaski in Poland. Now, he had a normal childhood at an early age. He played, he ran, he played soccer, he studied, got trouble, did the normal things that an 8-year-old would do. And he had a very nice childhood with his mother and father, my grandparents, and his 2 sisters, Irene and Sarah. And my grandparents owned a butcher shop. They sold non-kosher meat in the marketplace, but they made very good connections and very good friends at that time. And Dad was the middle child to Irene, the eldest, and little Sarah, the youngest. And he used to love to talk with Sarah. She used to laugh and giggle, and they had a real, just an amazing connection those two did. And as I said before, he had a normal life. Every week, my grandma would pour a hot bath for them, and all three would take a bath together. And then she'd warm up towels on the stove, bundle them all up, and get them all nice and dry. And that was something they did on a weekly basis. There are some memories that Dad had that stood out in his mind. And I'll try to point those out to all of you because they signify something very interesting in a young child's life, and of course, when he was remembering all this in his later years. And I'll point that out and give you some explanation of that. Now, it was around the time when he was 8 years old that Dad heard rumors from a German Jew family member named Gedalia that soon they'd be stripped of their possessions, businesses, and maybe even someday taken to labor camps, or even worse, exterminated. And this was around the 1940 time frame. Things began to get worse. The gendarmes and the German soldiers were everywhere. And Dad begins to feel this fear and terror. This is something of a subject that he has gone through when he was writing his book and during his nightmares and so on. And he became preoccupied with avoiding all of that at all costs. And soldiers would be abusing the neighbors with no cause at all. They were forced off the sidewalks when soldiers would walk nearby. And Dad would see soldiers grab their neighbors and never be seen again after that. They were on rations of food. They had to wear the yellow Jewish star to show that they were Jews. And interestingly, now and then, his mother would bring him in the backyard and feed him kielbasa, which is a sausage, a non-kosher meat, to keep the kids healthy and keep them surviving as best they could. As time passes, it becomes difficult for my grandparents to maintain the butcher shop. They always had to pay people off whoever was in command. Now time passes and he's 9 years old, and the Germans are everywhere. And the ghetto is changing. It's now closed off. You can no longer go to school, and you can no longer go outside of the area. It's closed off to all non-Jews in Sokolov, and going against these rules results in death. The ghetto is becoming overcrowded. There's another 2,000 refugees from adjacent farms that are coming in. People look like skeletons. Disease surrounding them, and many of them are begging on the streets for food. As I said, there's a rationing system now. My grandmother continues, despite the rest, to use their savings and their valuables to feed, to get meats, and to get food for the kids. But the town is turning into a complete cesspool. There's human waste and garbage everywhere. Dead bodies piled on top of each other. This is for a 9-year-old watching all of this. And Dad is terrified at all that's happening around him. And he continues to ask himself this question: where is God? Now, more time passes. It's 1942, and he is 10 years old. He's seen unspeakable acts by the Ukrainian soldiers who are now brought in by the Germans. And they don't see Jews as people. They refer to them as subhumans. They're stabbings for no reasons. Decomposing bodies are everywhere. And eventually, they witness and they see a crew comes in. They throw the dead bodies onto a wagon and they're carted out right outside the ghetto into a mass grave. for some reason, during the summer of 1942, the family was actually allowed to go to an adjacent farm. They lived in a big barn, and they ate really well. But unfortunately, that didn't last long. It was around the fall time frame, October, that they were told they had to return back to the ghetto. But for some reason, Irene was able to stay. And Dad found out later that she was remaining at good friends of theirs, the Gorski's home, which was only about 2 blocks out of town near them. And they were great customers and very good friends. October 10th, 1942. As they slept, the German Gestapo, the Polish police, and the Ukrainian soldiers surrounded the ghetto walls to begin the final liquidation. The Jews were to be rounded up and sent to Treblinka for extermination. Now, everybody in the town had many different ways of attempting to hide. With Dad, his parents, they had a hiding place, and it was a fake wall. And as the story goes, there were several adults in there, Dad, my grandfather, and there was this woman there. She was there with her little child, a baby. Unfortunately, that baby started fussing and crying and making noises. And everybody in the fake wall was pleading with her, please, keep your child quiet. Do what you can. Dad watches the mother. She places her hand over the child's mouth, to try to silence the child. Child arms and legs are flailing. And to Dad's disbelief, he sees the legs and the arms go limp. But it was too late. The soldiers heard everybody, began screaming at them to come out behind the wall. They weren't moving, so the soldiers began to fire shots through the wall, hitting many people dying. There were splinters flying off the wall, and one lodged inside Dad's lip, started bleeding, and he felt and tasted the blood. Again, that's one thing that stood out in his mind. The fear of pain, death. These are things that always went through his mind back then. So they had to, they all got pulled out, and they were rounded up around the town center, if you will. And behind where they were, there was this open sewer. His father turns to him. Now there's little Sarah, my father, and his father sitting next to each other. Irene is at the Gorski's home, and his mother is not to be seen. His father turns to him and tells him to run. He runs, he goes into the sewer, the open sewer, and he makes his way all the way to the edge of town, into a field. He stands up and he starts running. And he's running to this barbed wire fence, and he's surprised that nobody is screaming or shooting at him, nothing. And he doesn't know why. He makes it to the end of the fence, and he sees this old woman waving at him, hurry, come here. She lifts up the fence. He crawls underneath, and yet again, he remembers this one thing. He cut his knee, and he's bleeding. These are things that always came up in conversations with him. So he gets through there, and he's in the woods. He's going from farm to farm. He's trying to find food. He's trying to hide. This went on for 2 weeks. He finally decides he's got to go back to town and find his mother. And so he does. She gives him jewelry and valuables and tells him he needs to go to the Gorski's home to see if they will hide him as well. His world is changing once again. Abandonment, disbelief, and of course fear. Now through the snow, he does make it to the Gorski's home. And to no surprise, he knocks on the door. And Mrs. Gorski answers with such anger. She's screaming at him, you must leave. You have to leave. You're putting us in danger. And he's pleading with her. He is uncontrollably crying and giving her the valuables. Please help me. She's telling him, Irene's not even here. Go away. She finally decides to let him stay, but just for a few days. He's shown the attic. He's given a pail for a toilet, a sack of straw for a pillow. And he's told he has to go and hide in the attic so nobody can see him. Now, you have to remember that it was difficult for anyone to hide a Jewish male. The soldiers would walk by and tell the male to pull their pants down to determine if they were Jewish or not. And finally, after a few days, Irene shows up. She's there with hot water to wash him, but at this point, with everything that's been going on, it doesn't help. He's full of lice, he's full of vermin. And you have to know that the attic in the wintertime was extremely cold. And in the summertime, scalding hot. It was a tin roof. He was lice infested. His hair was long. There was no brushing his teeth, no baths, and very little food. And at this point, the Gorskys are afraid to kick him out. What if he's out there and the soldiers pick him up? Forces him to tell them where he was hiding. It puts the Gorskys at risk. It put Irene at risk, and of course, Dad was at risk. Now he would attempt to keep warm, laying in a fetal position, trying to keep warm up in the attic, but it was very hard for him to do that. Mrs. Gorski would bring up soup and bread. It was a very watered-down soup for his food. One of the other stories that he always talked about was Mr. Gorski. They had apple trees, and Mr. Gorski used to pick apples and put them in a bushel. And he put them up in the attic. But he would scold Dad and tell him not to touch the apples, or you'll be in trouble. They all knew at this time, what was he going to do? He could injure him, but he couldn't set him out. He couldn't kick him out. Dad was overwhelmed by hunger, and he succumbed to it. He grabbed an apple and he ate it. The next day, he grabbed another apple and he ate it. And he used to arrange the apples so that it wouldn't look like anything was missing. But of course, after a few times, it was obvious. And there was something about the fact that that stood out in his mind, probably fear. But Mr. Gorski marched up there and reprimanded him, screamed and yelled at him. But again, they were stuck with each other. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months. And Dad lived in the attic for 2 years. Now, another thing that he tried to do was there was a food trough outside of their house. It was remnants and so on from leftovers from food that they fed the animals. And at night, there are times that he would actually sneak downstairs and go through that trough to try to find some food. Because when you're in this situation, you will do whatever it takes to survive. Now, again, still hungry, filled with fear as well. He's up in the attic, and he couldn't run, as you all know. But he had these questions in his mind. Why should I die? What did I do? What sins did I commit? Where is God? This is the actual attic he stayed in for 2 years. Dad went back to Poland several times for visits, and he was able to go to the Gorski's home. They had passed long ago. And he was able to go up there and take pictures. Now, obviously, you can see everything, it's very light, but think about it, when there's no light, where you see the attic roof and the floor meet in that corner, that's where he hid, in darkness. The boredom in the attic was terrible, and he used to catch flies when he could and pull off their wings to make them his pets, and they'd walk around. This is what you did. He had dreams, he had nightmares, and he would dream about being the hero and saving the day. There were times when he became an artist. And when he had to pee, he would draw designs on the dirt floor. That was all fine and dandy until one time it leaked through. And, you know it landed on Mr. Gorski's head. He went back up there, he screamed, he yelled, but again, there was nothing that could be done. One of the stories, again, that he recalls is he pried open the metal roof, and out there he saw this young girl, this beautiful little pretty dress, sitting on a stump, eating a bowl of strawberries. Envious, very hungry, and wondering, why is she there? Why am I here? What did I do? Where is God? He used to be able to kind of relieve himself a little bit when it comes to frustrations. When there was a big thunderstorm or rain would come down, because the roof was metal, it would make such a loud noise that he actually was able to scream and yell at its loudest. And that helped him a bit get through all of this. But this is all he could do. So the weeks turned into 2 years, and now liberation begins. And the bombs are exploding everywhere, and one bomb actually blew off part of the roof that Dad was in the attic in. Of course, he was afraid. He made his way downstairs, found Irene. He found this big loaf of black bread and marmalade and just started devouring it. Bombs are blowing up everywhere. Meanwhile, the Gorskys, they made it out. They had a shelter underground. They made it out to that and stayed there. They would not let Irene or Dad come in there with them for the fear that if they were caught with a Jew, they would be killed. And also, if they died and there were Jews there, that was unheard of. Now, I asked you about, you ever wondered why you were born? What's your purpose? I'm reminding you of something, so I want you to hold on to that thought again. So they can't hide in the house, and they make their way to a chicken coop. They're attempting to hide in there. A Ukrainian soldier finds them, puts a gun to Irene's head. And at that moment, the other soldiers are yelling and calling him back. We found chickens and eggs. We found food. He lowers his gun and goes away. In that moment, you obviously knew what was going to happen, but they were saved. Now, eventually, they were liberated by the Russian army. And of the 6,000 Jews that were in town, only 29 survived. 2 children survived. Dad and Irene. His dad dies in the death camp at Treblinka. His mother, she survived in hiding, but 4 months before liberation occurred, she was turned in by a local Polish farmer. She was tied to a wagon, brought into the town to the Gestapos, and she was shot and killed in the cemetery. And little Sarah? Sarah, who has been breaking his heart all through his adult life, dies on the way to the gas chamber in the cattle car, Maybe perhaps she dies inside the gas chamber. People are climbing on top of each other to get to the ceiling to get a last breath of air. Maybe they did find some other unspeakable way to kill a 6-year-old child with no one around them to love them. And no one knows. No one will ever know. And life has changed once again. His Uncle Sam finds them. He's wearing a Polish army uniform. He doesn't know why or how. And he takes them to an orphanage to keep them safe. But soon Uncle Sam comes back and he takes Irene and Dad and he brings them through Prague to Germany, where they actually go to a DP camp, a displaced persons camp. And it's near Nuremberg, that's where they stayed. But it was a short period of time, and then they went to an adjacent farm to actually learn farming. Dad is not a farmer. He's 13 years old, he's a rebel, he's got his own way of thinking now. And interestingly, his Uncle Sam gave him a pistol for protection. But the elders, there were about 40 of them on the farm, once again, were yelling and screaming at him, "You're putting us in danger, and you have to get rid of it." So he actually traded the gun for a silver harmonica with an American GI soldier. And the soldiers really took a liking to him. They would give him candy and cigarettes. But Dad wouldn't take and consume them. He'd go off to the black market and sell them. Once again, placed in another DP camp. Now, over time, they find out that they have relatives in Chicago and in New York. And now Dad and Irene are assisted by the immigration agency under the children's quota, and they're told they're being sent to America. And life is about to change once again. So June 7, 1947, Dad and Irene leave on a ship called the Marine Marlin, and they land in New York. They're placed in an orphanage. Once again, another story. Dad had about $2 in his pocket. Back then, that's a lot of money. And he made his way down the street to a candy store. And he decides to spend all that money on candy. And he decides to eat all that candy. And soon after that, he gets very sick, throws up. Lesson learned. But his mindset was, I am never going to be hungry. So this is what he had, this is what he did. This is the mindset of a young kid. The stay in New York was short, so actually in July 1947 again, they actually traveled to Chicago. And they stayed with the Elster family, which was on my father's grandfather's side. And they were there for about 4 years. Now he's placed in 6th grade at the age of about 15 years old. He was allowed to skip, and he finally made it to high school. But it was extremely difficult for him to assimilate. He was shy, insecure. He really didn't have good communication skills. And he was still dealing with the nightmares that he had in his childhood. And he had those nightmares into his adulthood. My uncle used to joke all the time, "Never wake up, Aaron." They used to have to wake him up with a broomstick because he would be woken up out of these nightmares. Violent. And he continues to think about his sister Sarah. You know, he carries this burden of her death because he ran away. He found over time in his adulthood that he had belief in himself. He figured things out. And he knew that he holds his own future in his hands because of the strengths and the resiliency he had. High school was very difficult for him. He joined a group called the Lucky Knights. And you can see the picture up there, which was really more of a kind of a greaser group, if you will. But he seemed to be okay at that point. He met my mom and married her. And then soon after that, was carted off to the Korean War. And he became a supply sergeant there. And leave it to Dad, he always found a way to beat the system. As a supply sergeant, he would take the clothes and turn them in for new clothes, clean clothes. Well, he used to take a pair of pants, cut them in half, fold them up so it looks like two pair, and then he would turn in that one pair for two. That was Dad's mindset. Of course, he came back from the war. He needs to work. He started as a shoe salesman at a company called O'Connor and Goldberg. He became an insurance man after that, and in doing so, he said that he had no option of failure in his life. He wasn't going to allow anybody to control what he does. He was passionate about that. And he became a leader in sales for many years. And we reaped the benefits because he used to be invited to these presidential leadership conferences across the country, state to state. And we used to go on vacation with him all the time. He was usually ranked number one, or at least in the top three in this area for decades. And he created a wonderful life for Mom, myself, and my brother. I don't know if you've been taught about this, but there was a time back in 1977 when the Nazis were actually going to march through Skokie. And he was overheard saying, I know this for a fact because I actually heard him say it, that he wanted to rent a helicopter and tons of manure, fly it over there and dump it on him. So he was, yeah, let him come. But people had different feelings about that. And I want to read you a quote, which I thought was very insightful. This is from the museum, and it's kind of a double quote. I'll explain that. And I quote, "Ironically but exquisitely, it was the Skokie controversy that caused the survivors in Skokie and around the world to recognize that in the words of the new Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Skokie, they quote, despite their desire to leave the past behind, they could no longer remain silent, unquote. It was in the wake of the Skokie affair that Chicago area survivors joined together to form the Holocaust Memorial Foundation of Illinois. And as a result of this, survivors dedicated themselves to combating hate with education. And so now, with only a handful of survivors still alive to see that moment, we now have this extraordinary memorial and museum. Our family used to joke about Dad taking pictures. If you take a look at him, he does not look happy. But I can tell you, he was elated. He loves and loved his granddaughters. Those are my children. Sarah on the left, there's Mom, and Allison. They're both productive young ladies, successful right now. And Mom, she's 90 years old and still kicking. She's doing fantastic. My brother Bob, he lives in California with his son Jake, who's now 13 years old. And yes, he's a handful. Dad was a significant part of the Speakers Bureau from the museum. And he spoke with passion, love, acceptance, and he would speak to everyone. He used to get volumes of letters from younger adults wanting to adopt him as their own grandfather, but they would also tell him stories about how they stood up, how they became that upstander. And I know all of you think about this. How do I stand up individually as one person fend this problem or this controversy off. It is not easy, but you have to realize you do have the strength and the resiliency to perform that. Never forget that. And he spoke to churches and temples, the FBI, police recruits, and he would discuss the idea of being an upstander and stressing the importance of religious and race tolerance. He spoke of the importance as humans to learn from our mistakes and to continue to tell and retell the stories so as never to be a bystander. You know, we as a country, we cannot allow prejudice, bigotry, and hatred to rule our lives. Dad's story is told with power and integrity. And I highly suggest you find him on the internet, you read his book, or even better, you go visit him at the museum and talk to him directly. It's an amazing technology. And he worked with groups at the museum and visiting schools everywhere. The funny thing was, he would always jump into one of the tours that the volunteers would have with a group of students, just kind of jump in and follow along, and if there was something he could add, they'd always look to each other and, yeah, go ahead, and he would just elaborate on a story or something significant that occurred at that time frame. He's also been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, promoted his book, but more so, he involved my brother and I in many different things, and I was fortunate enough to go with him and help him. You know, all that kind of just gopher, but it was fun. Many knew Dad as the dapper gentleman. They used to refer to him as Elvis is in the building. Some of you may not know Elvis, but with the new movie out, I'm sure you do. They knew him as a passionate speaker, the trainer, the author, the orator, the committed vice president of the museum. But we knew him as Dad. He was the provider, the leader, and the hero in our family. And for how busy he was an insurance man. He'd work all day, come home to eat, and then go back out and do his sales calls, because that's where you had to make your sales, in the evening when the husband and wife were together to sell insurance. He was hardly around, but he always found time for us. Somehow, some way he did. And one of my fondest memories was back in high school. He used to attend every single, he never missed one, gymnastic meet of mine, from freshman year all the way to senior and into state meet. He included us in so many different things later in the years, especially his book writing, which my brother did an amazing job in helping him kick it off. I have to tell you a little story about how the 3D hologram was recorded. For 5 days straight, 5-hour sessions, over 2,000 questions and answers were exchanged. And he was sitting in that orb, all lit up, remembering the atrocities, recalling the atrocities, explaining them in detail. A question would be asked, how did you survive in the attic? And he would respond. And the interesting thing was the way the technology worked. When he was asked the question, he could be animated, and he could throw his arms around and lift his leg, it didn't matter. But as soon as he was done speaking, he had to get back to that resting position, left thumb over right thumb, feet flat on the ground, And he wore that outfit for 5 days straight. They cleaned it every day, but it was an extremely stressful circumstance for several of the survivors that went through the full 5 days of the recordings. You remember the question? You remember the chicken coop? Dad was saved for a reason. He was saved to tell his story, to advocate his message to all of you, to us. Now, this is more of a rhetorical question to all of you, but something to think about. Have you ever had a live hero mentor you? I have. And I'm here now to continue his message. I want to leave you with this saying. It's very insightful. It's very powerful by Pastor Martin. Read it, understand it, acknowledge it, please. From the bottom of my heart, I am flattered and honored to be here today. If I'm able to get through to just one of you, I've succeeded. I've succeeded in my promise to my Father. I have succeeded in his promise to all of you. You see, the ripple effect of one person talking to another is the way to continue all the survivor stories. I want to thank Mrs. O'Brien and all of you for allowing me the time to spread Dad's message and to continue his story. Thank you. If you cannot see that, I will read it. You make this a little bigger so I can actually see it. First they came from the socialists, and I did not speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came from the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. But I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak for me.
Let's give Mr. Elster another round of applause. All right, we have time for we have time for a few questions. So if you were in your ELA class yesterday or today and you wrote out a question and your teacher gave you that card, could you please raise your hand and we're going to try to get through as many questions as possible. Yes.
Could you repeat that?
How did your relationship with your dad change when you found out he was a Holocaust survivor?
So early on in our childhood, up until 18, 20, 21 years old, we knew nothing about it. At that age, he started telling us the real stories, not the fantasy things that we heard or the fairy tale stuff that we heard. He told us the reality of it. I personally did not feel any different. I was shocked, but I didn't feel any different towards Dad. It wasn't until later in the years when our firstborn, Sarah, she was born, and we started talking about how is the kid going to be raised, Jew, non-Jew. I married a non-Jewish woman. So there was questions about that. And as I saw him progress and feel more comfortable in speaking to others, that's when things changed. To the point where I was talking to my father as an adult. And that was a big change for me, and especially in the writing of this book. Completely different mindset that I had about him. My respect for my father went from normal to sky high. Because I used to edit his chapters and help him, and he'd read a line or two, it didn't sound right, and he would go into 15, 20 minutes of the description and the details behind that, just that one line in the book. I learned a lot and changed my way of thinking about him.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
How long did it take for the hologram to be set up?
Wow, that's a good question. So the Shoah Foundation, in conjunction with another organization, began this process many years ago. The technologies weren't quite there, and they got to the point a few years later where they were mature enough where you saw the orb, if I can get to that. Probably not. There we go. Where they set that up. They had those little black dots that you see in the green screen were all cameras. And then there were lights above all that to illuminate. And the process of the 5 days of questions and answers were only a part of it. All the guys behind the scenes, the technical guys, the software engineers, they had to take all of those answers, put them in a database, and then enumerate, allow the questions to have keywords in the question so that the natural language would then search for the answer. It took weeks for them to get it to that point. Actually, it took months. And so that whole process for one survivor probably was a 3 or 4 month process.
Do we have another question? Yeah, so we... Do you believe your father has raised you differently based on what he had gone through?
Oh my gosh, yes. Absolutely 100%. He gave us choices. He even gave us the choice if we wanted to go to Hebrew school or not. We said no, we didn't go. So, yes, the way we were punished, the way we were disciplined, the way we were talked to, yes, absolutely stems from how and what he went through as well.
Are there any other questions? Okay, very well. Very well. Thank you very much, Mr. Elster. We are very appreciative of your time.